Force of nature. The Enterprise crew discovers they have been actively destroying space for 7 seasons.
Data enters Geordi's quarters to find him trying to get Spot out from under the bed. Geordi says that Spot has broken his precious Ming vase and is generally ruining his room.
Data says maybe Geordi borrowing Spot to experience what it was like to have a cat probably wasn't the best idea, and Geordi is surprised to find that Data has never trained Spot in any way, saying Spot is out of control.
Something that apparently a super intelligent robot would never have figured out on his own. The Enterprise is searching for the Fleming, a missing medical transport, and they have to travel through the Hakaris corridor, which is the only area in this region of space that is free of tetryon fields, which would affect ships traveling at warp.
Geordi says they'll increase sensor efficiency to find the Fleming, even though that's caused a ton of problems in the past, and I hope they don't detect any 2D particles or whatever the hell happened the last time he increased sensor efficiency. Troy says there's a planet nearby, but they haven't heard anything about the Fleming, and Beverly points out that there was also a Ferengi ship nearby, and maybe they captured the Fleming.
Geordi goes down to engineering, but instead of working on the sensors, he tries to increase the power conversion levels of the engine or something, and Data asks why he wants to do that when it will not improve engine efficiency, which I would think it would, based on what they're saying, but I don't know.
And Geordi reveals that he's been in touch with an engineer named Kaplan on another ship, and they're basically trying to one-up each other.
But when Geordi goes to ask the computer, it says the conversion levels have not changed.
He and Data keep going around the ship, trying to improve stuff, and while I appreciate the fact that the writers were trying to make everything more dynamic, this scene went on for too long without giving us anything new, so the writers actually succeeded in making everything more boring.
And even when they increase the sensor efficiency, it does not increase by as much as they'd hoped. And they talk more about training Spot, and Geordi suggests stunning it with a phaser. And when Data is outraged, Geordi lies and says he was kidding.
Geordi says his sister trained her cat, and she was an idiot. So Data, the hyper-intelligent robot, shouldn't really have any problem doing it.
They finally reach a misaligned buffer when they're crawling through these tunnels, and they fix it, but it only increases sensor efficiency by another small amount.
Riker pings them, saying they picked up a ship, and I thought this whole searching for the misalignment scene was going to end up with them finding some mysterious malfunction or seeing some CGI sparkles eating away at the ship's innards, but it was all for a 1% increase in sensor efficiency, but at the cost of a 10% decrease in my patience.
The ship turns out to be a Ferengi transport that is running on low power levels.
But Geordi says he can adjust the hydroronic deflectors to generate a bioregenerative Viridium subroutine that would let the Ferengi contact them.
The Ferengi ship suddenly begins firing on the Enterprise, so Picard orders them to disable their weapons. And the Ferengi ship's power systems suddenly stabilize, and Riker says they were only pretending to be disabled.
Geordi continues his plan to open communications, but I would think if they were just faking, their communications would work also, and Geordi wouldn't have to do that.
They were still cutting off their means of communication, so from the Enterprise side, they still couldn't communicate.
Yeah, they need to force them to do it, I guess.
But we've seen that they can force them to do that.
Was that between 2 Federation ships?
I think it was with the Packlids.
Okay. Picard demands to know why they were attacked, and the Ferengi claims that the Enterprise disabled his ship. And when Picard says they should talk about it, the Ferengi refuses. So Picard says, no sweat, we'll just leave you here. And the Ferengi says, oh shit, I'm an idiot. Yeah, let's talk.
He tells them that they found what looked like a Federation signal buoy that emitted an energy pulse that disabled their ship. And Riker mentions the missing Federation ship, and the Ferengi say that they passed a Federation ship a few days earlier, but it didn't appear to be in distress.
He says its position might be in their logs, so Picard offers up some engineers to speed up their recovery.
In exchange for the information. Data is trying to give Spot orders, and it's not working, when Geordi walks in and says maybe Spot isn't trainable after all.
But the opposite seems to be working just fine.
When Spot gets Data to give him a ball of yarn. Or her, even though it was a him in earlier episodes.
So I started to suspect maybe this was some sort of alternate universe.
Or maybe Spot is a Romulan spy. And Brent Spiner's acting at multiple points in this scene is too much, and does not accurately convey the sense of an emotionless robot.
Agreed. In engineering, Geordi reveals that Kaplan sent him a mocking message bragging about his ship's efficiency, so there's another pointless conversation about the Enterprise doing the same before we cut back to the actual story of the episode.
Up on the bridge, Data tells Picard about a debris field that may be the remains of the Fleming, and he picks up an unknown object that emits a Verteron field or something which disables the Enterprise.
A new ship approaches and beams 2 people into engineering who claim that the Enterprise is killing them.
They have a big meeting where the aliens tell Picard that the use of warp fields in the area is causing gravitational disruptions that will make their planet uninhabitable.
Geordi says the aliens have made this claim before, but the Federation said it didn't hold any water, and the aliens say they weren't happy with that and resorted to disabling ships passing through to get attention.
And Riker says that even if that didn't result in casualties, it was still a hostile act. The aliens say they could help the Enterprise get their engines back online more quickly if they agree to look at their research. And Picard says okay, but the recovery of the Fleming is their priority, and if they don't disable the probes, Picard will have them taken to a starbase to face charges. So they agree.
Later, in engineering, Geordi's still annoyed at what the aliens, Rabal, and Serova did, and Serova says, well, it's just an inconvenience. Get over it. And Geordi counters with the fact that ships such as the Fleming might have been carrying vital perishables to save lives. And Serova says, well, that didn't happen, so there, which is great defense. And then to escape the conversation, she says there's no point in talking to Geordi anymore because she knows he won't listen.
And that's what I always tell people I'm arguing with. There's no point in arguing because I've already decided I'm not going to listen.
And she storms off.
Rabal tells Geordi that he didn't believe Serova's theories about warp drive at first either, but now they're going to try to convince their people to give up on warp drives altogether.
Which would effectively isolate their entire planet.
Data explains their theory to Picard and says they believe that the corridor may contain regions of subspace instability that could rupture under the effects of warp fields.
But they don't explain what that would actually mean, which I was very interested in, having subspace break into normal space. Maybe everybody would become 2D.
And Data says there is insufficient data to determine if that would actually happen.
And in order to prove it, a weak region would have to be exposed to a warp field 1,000,000 times greater than a ship generates. But Rabal counters that the effect is cumulative, which Data says could be true, and they need to do more research.
They suggest a more detailed investigation by Starfleet, which Rabal accepts, but Serova is not satisfied in the slightest.
And she storms out again.
Later, Riker tells Picard they have found the Fleming, and Geordi says the Enterprise engines are back online, conveniently right on time. But Serova takes the alien ship on her own.
She says she'll give them proof of her research and blows herself up, which opens up the theoretical subspace rift.
Data says the Fleming is still intact, but is within the rift, and they start being hit by distortion waves, whatever those are, from within the rift, and Data says the Fleming shields will only last about 12 hours.
Geordi says they can't go into warp because it will just make things worse, so at this point, they're stuck.
Because it will take weeks to reach them at impulse. Geordi, Data, and Rabal study the rift to try to find another option.
And Data wonders if there are safe spots where they can use the warp engines inside the rift, which honestly sounded ridiculous since the event itself was caused by warp energy, and thankfully that is not something they actually do. But I was expecting them to say, yeah, let's do it.
And they find an area of subspace instability outside the rift, which Data says should not be possible, even though I feel like they've encountered that a bunch of times before, and they're already dealing with a straight-up rift in subspace. That's what the whole thing is about.
Yeah, couldn't it just be the start of another rift?
Data is just such a smart robot.
He suggests to Picard that they give a burst of warp power and coast in and out of the rift, negating their need to use warp inside of the rift. And isn't that the same thing they did in Booby Trap? They had a little burst and then kind of drifted through.
It wasn't with the warp engines, though.
But wasn't it the same principle?
Yeah, but I'm pretty sure that's not how the warp engines work, because they're supposed to put, like, a warp field around the ship, and that's what lets them move faster. The ship itself isn't what's propelling itself forward. So this idea shouldn't work, based on what they've said before.
Okay.
Have I mentioned how much I love the level of understanding that these writers have of their own show?
Data says they'll only have 2 minutes of warp speed to do everything, and Picard says, let's go for it.
In engineering, Geordi laments to Data that they should have known better because they were supposed to be experts in warp travel, and none of this should have happened, and he shouldn't have been so resistant to Serova.
But Data points out that her theories were based on unprovable assumptions. But Geordi's under the impression that her methods, including killing everyone to prove her theories, were justified, so I'm glad he's the chief engineer on this floating energon bomb.
I don't know if I agree with that conclusion, but okay. Geordi finds Rabal in 10 forward and says maybe he should have looked at the research more closely, but Rabal says they needed more time and Serova was unwilling to wait.
So I like that he actually pointed out that Serova was not being safe in her methods.
Yeah, I'm glad that they weren't both one-dimensional, just one of them. And Rabal says they'll have to change the way they look at space travel, which Geordi says is going to be difficult with how much they rely on warp travel. But this whole thing was an event that occurred because of special circumstances. I would think they could still figure things out.
That sounds like an unproven theory based on assumptions.
Yeah, that's true. I guess I'll have to blow a hole in subspace to prove it.
The ship enacts its warp burst plan, and they coast into the rift. They find the Fleming, but it's about to initiate its warp drive, which would make things worse. And the Enterprise can't get there in time, so things get worse.
Data says they no longer have enough momentum to escape. They get close enough to begin transporting over the crew of the Fleming, and Riker suggests doing some kind of energy discharge thing with the impulse reactor, but Data says it would create an explosion that would destroy the saucer section. So I want to know what exactly Riker was thinking, and why he thought it would work.
Geordi says they can use a distortion wave to surf out of the rift, and he asks Riker, when's the last time you went surfing? And the answer would be never. I cannot imagine Riker having ever surfed, or really any of this crew having surfed anywhere in their entire lives.
And that was a point where I started laughing while watching the episode. Geordi's plan doesn't work the first time, so Data suggests moving at impulse speed first, instead of just sitting there waiting for the wave to slam into them, which you would think they would have thought of already, especially since they have used some kind of energy waves to propel the Enterprise before.
But see, they wouldn't know that because none of them have actually surfed before. Don't you know so surfers just sitting there waiting for the waves to slam into them?
And they end up being carried by the wave and escape the rift.
I like how Worf said, structural breach is imminent, but then there just isn't one and they're okay.
Later, Geordi and Rabal tell Picard that they've mapped out the most likely possible locations where subspace rifts could form, and they show images of what would happen over the next 40 years if warp drives are still used.
That was a neat little diagram Rabal had there. He could have used some better transitions, though, like a spin-in or a screen wipe. That would have been cool. Maybe some sound effects.
Picard reads a message from Starfleet telling everyone not to go past Warp 5 unless there's an emergency. So, any typical episode of Star Trek.
And everyone immediately points out that practically no one is going to follow that directive, including the writers, but they quickly move on.
And Rabal says his planet's orbit is already getting messed up. So Picard says they're setting up a weather control system.
Yeah, I didn't realize Cobra was a member of the Federation.
But he doesn't say anything about maybe getting the people off the planet or, doing anything else.
We close with Picard pontificating that all these years he's been damaging that which he's held most dear. But Geordi says they still have time to make things better before hopping into his Hummer made out of coal, filling it up to the brim with gas, and peeling out straight through the ozone layer.
Made out of coal.
Force of nature. Overall?
What a weird episode. I still can't believe that it actually ended with something that should permanently affect things going forward. I hope they bring up the warp issues in subsequent episodes, but I really feel like they're just going to forget all about it. For an episode involving a big, important discovery, other than that, it really just felt like a typical TNG episode, and not a very good one. Serova was a disappointingly simplistic character. Rabal was better, at least, but he didn't have enough to do. Too much of the episode focused on Geordi and Data, but all the stuff about energy conversions and training Spot didn't end up affecting anything, and wasn't all that interesting to begin with. And the Ferengi didn't end up mattering at all either. And then of course we got a lot of technobabble bullshit. I could get behind the overall ideas here, but the episode needed a better script, and more for the characters to do that actually had something to do with the plot. Geordi and Picard feeling guilty for their attitudes wasn't given enough development, and having them feel upset about things here, but totally brush off tons of other stuff in the past, didn't feel convincing for their characters. I gave this episode a C-.
See, that's pretty high for this episode. That was really bad.
I knew you were going to say that.
I gave this one a D-. So what does it mean if subspace extrudes into normal space, besides a nice, pretty purple swirl? What are the actual ramifications of it? It was really too bad they didn't explain that further. And the rift is formed from warp energy 1,000,000 times stronger than the one a ship can generate. If it's cumulative, does that mean each time is a +1 until you reach 1,000,000? Because that would take a long time. Or is it a compounding effect, which would make it happen a little bit faster? Because space is pretty big, and even though there's the corridor, which ostensibly saves time, could they not just find an alternate route through space, since, it's space and there's not, stuff in their way? Serova was frustrating and saying, "I'll put the lives of anyone and everyone in danger to prove my point," is more dangerous than the outcome she's trying to prevent. For being such a brilliant scientist, she was a baby throwing tantrums. And I can't stand people like that in real life. And her method of storming out of the room when things are said that she doesn't want to hear was not surprising and just as frustrating. And I noticed at the end of the episode, while discussing the events and how they'll move forward with their way of thinking, nobody mentioned her at all, including her brother, which I thought was pretty amusing. And since they're in space, can you explain to me why ships can't just give a warp burst and coast indefinitely? I'm no scientist, but wouldn't some sort of friction be needed to slow them down out there? Why couldn't their method of travel be burst, stop for object in the way, turn, burst, repeat?
Yeah, and that brings up the question of even just normal travel. Why are their engines going the whole time? You'd be constantly picking up speed if your engines kept going. So, I don't know.
So the whole Spot thing was pointless, and the whole Kaplan thing was pointless. Maybe if they had made Kaplan the engineer on the Fleming, instead of a completely unrelated ship, that would have helped a little bit. And both of these things took up a good chunk of the episode. They weren't even B-plots because they ended up having no bearing or resolution on anything that happened in this episode. And to that point, the Ferengi were completely pointless too. I would have thought the Ferengi would have done something stupid to activate or increase the rift, because that's kind of what they do in this show, but they just faded out after doing nothing, which was great writing. And what about this existing rift? Will it get bigger by itself? What if a ship doesn't know about it? How far away does a ship have to be to avoid triggering it? Could things besides ships going by affected in any way? And the weak spots they found were just in this sector. And they kind of pointed out there were probably other spots in other sectors, but it seemed like a gargantuan problem that would affect the entire galaxy's way of life, but they just kind of shrug at it. And I doubt they're going to follow this Warp 5 rule. They'll just claim in every instance that it's an emergency, or they'll just ignore it altogether.
See, that's why I went as high as I did, is because it did involve something that mattered, theoretically, which I appreciated, but I agree that it probably won't end up mattering after this episode.
And again, these people can negotiate treaties between violent races that have been at war for centuries. They can configure warp matrices to navigate through black holes. They can identify quantomolecular particles and isolate the electroplasmic neutrinos from the delta nanowaves. But they still can't figure out how to take care of a f***ing cat. I'm done with those jokes. I'm done with Spot. They need to just blast it out into space and be done with it. But anyway, I gotta get out of here. I gotta go pick up my kids from logging school because we don't want to be late for the oil symposium.
Okay, that's dumb, but okay.